Welcome to this series of short webinars by the Legal Response International, LRI. For those of you who don't know LRI, we are an NGO that provides free legal support to developing countries, as well as to other NGOs at the international climate change negotiations. We also assist developing countries in implementing the Paris Agreement in their national legislations and policies. This series of short webinars is designed to give an introduction to key elements of the Paris Agreement and is based on our recently published Guide to the Paris Agreement. A link to download this book for free is available at the end of this webinar. Today's webinar provides an introduction to the international climate change regime that was created by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There will be a short online quiz with 10 questions at the end of the webinar if you want to test your knowledge and understanding of this topic. Our speaker today is a Brazilian lawyer, Caroline Dihl Prolo. Caroline has been involved in the climate change negotiations since 2012. She has worked with LRI for many years and regularly provides legal support to developing country delegations at the negotiations. She has also established a service like LRI in Latin America called La Clima. I'm very pleased to introduce and welcome Caroline. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about the international background of the climate change regime, which I think is an essential knowledge to anyone who wants to study or even follow the field of climate change. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. As I'm sure you already know, recently it has become popular to refer to climate change as a climate crisis or climate emergency. The idea, of course, is to express the magnitude and the urgency of the problem. And this is not, of course, a trivial problem. This is the biggest problem, the problem of humankind. And we have reached a point where we have to face it as such, have to face it even as we would face a calamity, as you've probably been heard about in the news. And how did we get here is the question. I think to understand the climate crisis, we need first to understand the international regime for climate change under the United Nations. And this is a regime that has been going on for 28 years. In other words, I guess this is a problem that is not new to the international community. In 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the United Nations Framework Climate Change Convention was signed. The acronym is UNFCCC. And it entered into force 2 years later in 1994. And as you can see in the preamble, which I very much like to quote at all times, this was a moment where there was huge engagement by the international community. At least we can tell it by the words that they chose. This was a moment where the countries were determined to protect the climate system for the present and future generations. And an interesting feature of this convention is that it is based upon some important principles, and they are all explicitly stated in the Article 3 of the treaty. One of the most important of them is the precautionary approach, which states that the lack of scientific certainty should not be a reason for countries to take the proper measures to avoid climate change. And at that time, this was necessary because climate science was still very incipient. It was only later in 2007 when the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was published that the scientists would state with higher confidence that the climate change is predominantly human-induced. So at that time, the time when the convention was signed, it was very important to trust the science and thus to have the precautionary approach explicitly stated in the treaty. Another extremely important principle is the principle of intergenerational equity, which provides that actions by the current generation must not undermine the rights of the next generation to live in a balanced climate system. And I think a testament to the importance of this principle is the movement led by Greta Thunberg and also the many lawsuits that are being filed by young people all over the world in an attempt to enforce these rights to a balanced climate system. And as well as the current and the future generations struggle, it's important to take into consideration the struggles of these generation. So during this process to address climate change, it's important to bear in mind that certain countries bear other vulnerabilities and have other priorities, such as the eradication of poverty, for instance. And therefore, these countries must not be disproportionately burdened by the actions necessary to address climate change. And possibly, I think the most famous principle under the convention is the one called Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, which acknowledges that although all countries bear a responsibility to act on climate change, the measures of their responsibilities is differentiated in accordance with their capabilities and their contributions to the climate crisis. And to ensure the differentiation between these countries, the convention took an interesting approach. It listed the countries which bear more responsibilities in an annex, which became famous as the Annex 1. These annex, in these annex particularly, are those countries that are considered to be the developed countries, which at the time were basically the industrialized countries, the OECD members. The ones left out of this list are the developing countries, and they became known as the non-Annex 1 countries. The convention allocated responsibilities between developed and developing countries in accordance with this differentiation, and in such a way that the developed countries were the ones designated to lead the process. So this means that while all countries are obliged to take certain measures to formulate programs that contain climate change mitigation measures, only the developed countries were obliged to effectively limit their own emissions of greenhouse gases. And also the developed countries are the ones under the obligation to even provide financial support to the developing countries so that they can fulfill their obligations. And in fact, the convention makes it very clear that the developing countries are only bound to these obligations to the extent that they receive financial support from the developed countries. But the convention, as you probably can see now, prescribed these obligations in a very broad and programmatic manner. So there were no details, no quantification, no indication as to how and to what extent the developed countries were supposed to fulfill those obligations. Then it became clear that another protocol, another instrument would be necessary to provide more details and clarify the obligations of the developed countries. And that's when the Kyoto Protocol took place. It was signed in 1997, but it would only enter into force in 2005. And you might recognize this one signing the document in the right side. This is then the then Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, but his successor, President Bush, and the American Congress would not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and thus the United States did not become a party to this agreement. In time, what we saw is that developing countries would also volunteer actions to limit their own emissions, right? So as the developed countries had their quantified emission limitation and reduction commitments, developing countries would submit their NAMAs, their nationally appropriate mitigation actions. And in fact, this was a moment of increasing ambition in the international community, the Bali Action Plan. This is when conversations started to converge into building even a new agreement, a new and a stronger agreement with more countries and covering more emissions that we had so far with only developed countries bound by the Kyoto Protocol. So this process was expected to be finished by the COP in Copenhagen in 2009. And this was also fueled by the 2007 assessment report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was the moment, as I told in the beginning, when the IPCC found with very high confidence that human-induced causes of climate change were the predominant reason for the climate change effects that we were already facing. So that came as a very strong sign from science that more ambitious and bold action was necessary by the international community. Unfortunately, though, in the end, the Copenhagen COP was not very successful. Instead of negotiating a bolder and more ambitious agreement, a group of countries met in closed doors and submitted a proposal for what in fact was a very weak agreement with no binding mitigation obligations whatsoever. So this was not even an agreement that was reached by the parties. And then we came out of Copenhagen with our empty hands. But it was important, this moment was actually perhaps a turning point when it became very clear that the old geopolitical order was changed and it was time to change the approach in the negotiations. So the division of the world in that binary view between developed and developing countries, and the division of responsibilities in the agreement as such, was no longer bearable, especially in a context where emerging economies like China and India have become actually major carbon emitters. So a global agreement to include all countries was being demanded at the time. And then parties began to negotiate this new legal instrument in Durban, South Africa, in a 5 years process, which was called the Durban Platform. The Durban Platform led eventually to Paris in 2015, where a historic agreement was reached, a true miracle of international diplomacy, with the 196 countries adopting the Paris Agreement. This is a treaty that is embedded within the convention, the UNFCCC, as the Kyoto Protocol, and it intends to further implement the convention, but of course it has its own obligations and its own principles. And I will only highlight a few things here, but it's interesting to see the change, the shift in the approach that we had before with the protocol. And now with the Paris Agreement, we really have a new working under different assumptions in a different context, starting by the fact that one of the objectives of the agreement is actually avoid this increase in the global temperature, hold the increase in the global temperature to well below 2 degrees to Celsius degrees, and pursuing efforts to even limit to 1.5 Celsius degrees. So we can see that different from the context in the convention, where we even needed a precautionary approach explicitly stated in the convention to make sure that that science would be of value to that process. In the Paris Agreement, it's very clear that science is the cornerstone of the agreement, and even because now we do, because of science, thanks to science, we are able to determine precisely what's the amount of temperature increase that can be dangerous to the climate stability. So it's not anymore an issue of using the precautionary approach, but we're now talking about a prevention of a damage that is known and certain. Another interesting new logic to this Paris Agreement is the fact that it brings the private sector to the center of the actions that are necessary to implement the Paris Agreement. So it makes clear in one of these objectives that it's necessary to make the financial flows consistent with this pathway to a new low carbon economy. So that's an interesting approach of the Paris Agreement. And finally, the obligation of the Paris Agreement, the core obligation of the Paris Agreement, as I said, is one that is held by all parties. It's the so-called nationally determined contribution, the NDC. So the NDC is an obligation by all parties. Actually, each party, as we can see shall prepare, communicate, and maintain NDCs that are successive in time. So this is a binding obligation that countries shall elaborate their contributions and communicate it and maintain it and continuously improve it. It's of course an obligation of, it's a procedural obligation, but as well there is an obligation to pursue best efforts to implement these obligations, as we can see in the second part of this paragraph 4.2. And these obligations, as I said, they are nationally determined. So they are determined by the country itself in accordance, obviously, with their national circumstances. And this is another interesting feature of this new agreement, is that it gives a nuance to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, that it must be read now in light of the different national circumstances of countries. So now we don't actually have that old binary view of the world as in developed and developing countries. Now it's something that must be determined in accordance with the specific circumstances of that country. Well, that was all. I hope it was a good and productive session for you all. And you can find more about the international climate regime and the Paris Agreement in the guide to the Paris Agreement by accessing the link in this page. And also, if you have any inquiries, you can send an email to inquiries@legalresponse.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Caroline. Thank you for your presentation today.